40,000 years ago, two titans of humanity shared the same land, but only one survived to tell the tale. It was not force that decided, nor intelligence, as many think. The truth remained buried among the ashes, the broken bones, and the secrets that still resonate in the blood that flows through our veins. Who were they? Warriors, victims, or simple pawns in a much larger game, whose game board was none other than the planet itself, in full metamorphosis? And more disturbing still, is this silent duel really over? Prepare for a journey to the heart of prehistory, where Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals clashed not only for their survival, but for the very future of humanity. What you're about to discover could shake up everything you thought you knew about what we really are. Imagine a huge, wild and cruel world, where the seasons are not just about climate change. They are a matter of life and death. A planet that breathed hard in the middle of great transitions, where vast coniferous forests alternated with frozen plains. This was the scenario that prevailed in Europe and Asia around 40,000 years ago, a phase of extremes shaped by the last ice age. During the short summers, the tundra teemed with life. Small rodents, herds of large herbivores such as bison, mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses occupied the landscape. But the winters were harsh. Temperatures dropped to deadly levels. Biting winds carried ice and death. Only the fittest, or cunning, could survive these merciless cycles. The mountains of Central Europe were covered in eternal layers of ice. Rivers, many of which were wider and more turbulent than today, were veins of hope, because where there was water, there was life, and where there was life, there was competition. It was a world of scarcity and sudden abundance, of lightning fast opportunities and invisible pitfalls. Those who lived there had to understand the nuances of the earth, the sky, the seasons, and the animals that shared this frozen universe. But who dominated these lands? Who left deep footprints on the muddy banks of icy rivers? Two types of human beings walked side by side in this wild territory, the Neanderthals and the Cro-Magnons. Different lineages, different stories, but destinies intertwined by an invisible force: survival. You Neanderthals, they were already veterans of this unforgiving world. Appearing around 400,000 years ago, they had shaped their bodies according to the brutality of the environment. They were compact, muscular, with broad chests and large noses that helped warm the frigid air before it reached the lungs. True experts in resisting the bitter cold, adapted like no other creature to the harshness of this era. Already the Cro-Magnons, newly arrived in Europe from Africa, were foreigners. Taller, more slender, with globular skulls and more delicate faces. They carried within them something that would change everything: new ideas, new weapons, new strategies. Where the Neanderthal was a master of brute force and intimacy with the earth, the Cro-Magnon brought the flame of innovation. But the world these two groups shared was changing, and change does not favor those who are perfectly adapted to what already exists. It favors those who know how to transform themselves. Glaciations advanced and retreated like gigantic seas of ice, reshaping rivers, altering forests, extinction of entire species in a matter of decades. The Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals were forced to move their camps, to reinvent their hunts, to look for new sources of food. The rules of the game were changing rapidly, and not all players were prepared for these new demands. Night fell faster. The cold became more bitter. Prey has become rarer. And the meetings between these two human beings were not just chance. They carried the weight of the entire future of the human species. Near the smoky fires, as the wind howled like a hungry spirit, the eyes of Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons met. In the darkness, friends, enemies, rivals, predators. The answer was not so simple. It was hidden in the details of cave paintings, in the bones buried in forgotten caves, in the tools chipped with surgical precision. The table was set. The merciless weather has thrown its invisible dice, and as the tundra stretched endlessly beneath the stars, two types of humanity headed toward a destiny neither could predict. But before we understand who these ancient rivals really were, we must open our eyes to the inhabitants of this primitive world. Not just the Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals, but all the creatures that roared, ran, and fell beneath the grey skies of prehistory. If we want to understand the duel between Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal, we must first know the other silent protagonists of this story. The frozen landscape was a battlefield where every creature fought for its existence every day. Above the icy plains, woolly mammoths. They crossed in slow caravans, their curved tusks crisscrossing the grey sky. Covered in a thick layer of fur, they were living fortresses against the cold. They followed ancestral routes, taking the same paths taken by previous generations, always in search of sparse pastures. Woolly rhinoceros, with their massive bodies and sharp horns, were equally imposing. But unlike mammoths, they preferred isolation. A healthy adult was almost invulnerable, except to the most daring predators. Wild horses. In large groups, they ran like lightning across the tundra, their paws kicking up clouds of snow and frozen dust. They were one of the main sources of food and therefore the target of sophisticated hunting strategies. Deeper cave bear took shelter during the harsh winters. These giants, distant relatives of today's bears, preferred deep caves where they slept for months, relying on the fat accumulated during the short summer. Among the shadows, they also hid cave lions, formidable predators, larger and more muscular than their African cousins today. Silent, patient, deadly. It was in this environment that the Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals had to hunt, protect themselves, and often fight not only against animals, but also against the relentless forces of nature. But there was a fundamental difference between the two, the way they saw the world. Neanderthals were masters of local adaptation. His tools were robust, reliable. They cut stones with refined technique to create spearheads, leather scrapers, and hand axes. They knew how to explore every piece of a slaughtered animal: meat, bones, skins, tendons. They traveled in small family groups with in-depth knowledge of their territories. Their caves bear traces of care provided to the sick and elderly, testimony to a rare compassion among predators. They not only survived, lived fully among the gnarled trees and treacherous snow, the Cro-Magnons, they saw beyond that. For them, hunting was not just about survival. It was a symbol. It was art. Their troglodyte shelters like Chauvet and Lascaux, decorated with vibrant paintings of horses, bison, and predators, were not mere decorations. They were rituals. Rituals to ensure hunting, summon invisible forces, communicate stories, fears and hopes. Their tools were more varied, lighter, more adaptable. Rudimentary bows and arrows, nets, hooks. They invented new ways to hunt, to protect themselves, to live. They were always looking for something more efficient, faster, and more deadly. While Neanderthals struggled to survive in a world they knew, deeply Cro-Magnon man created new worlds in his own head. This difference, discreet but monumental, would begin to make all the difference. Because as animals migrated, rivers changed course, seasons became unpredictable. Surviving was no longer just a matter of physical strength or endurance. It was a question of anticipation, strategy, imagination. And this ability to imagine the invisible, to predict the unpredictable, would become the greatest weapon of all. But what strategies did these two groups use to cope with the brutality of life? How did their hunting, defense, and survival tactics shape their destiny? This is where the real battle begins. In the brutal game of prehistory, being strong was not enough. Practical intelligence, cunning, the ability to anticipate environmental pitfalls, these were the real assets. Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, each in their own way, developed brilliant tactics to hunt, protect themselves, and survive. Neanderthals were natural hunters. With heavy spears, they dominated the melee like few others. Let's imagine the scene. A group of Neanderthals surrounding an enormous bison, their eyes attentive, their muscles tense. They attacked at point-blank range, in coordinated ambushes, using brute force and precision to bring down colossal prey. His mastery of fire was masterful. Keeping a flame alive day after day in the midst of freezing winds was a matter of life and death. They built shelters with animal skins and bones, creating small fortresses against the cold and nocturnal predators. But there was a hidden vulnerability. Because they relied heavily on hunting large animals and the stability of their environment, Neanderthals were less flexible when things went wrong. A severe drought, an abnormal migration of prey, and the entire group could succumb. The Cro-Magnons, on the other hand, played a completely different game. They were masters of variety. Did they hunt large animals? Yes. But they also fished in frozen rivers, captured small rodents and collected eggs and roots hidden under the snow. Their diet was more diverse, more resilient. They didn't depend on a single food source. They depended on their creativity and in terms of technology, the Cro-Magnons revolutionized hunting. While the Neanderthal man faced his prey almost hand-to-hand, the Cro-Magnon preferred distance. They used darts, threw spears, perhaps the thruster called ATL, which increased the force and range of the launches. They hunted in complex ambushes, using traps, camouflaged holes, strategies that involved patience and anticipation. And there was another fundamental difference: the ability to plan in a group, share symbolic information. While Neanderthals communicated effectively about basic needs, hunting, danger, shelter, the Cro-Magnons seem to have gone further. They developed symbols, art, and perhaps even organized rituals that strengthened social cohesion. They were able to visualize the invisible, future migratory routes, the cycles of the seasons, the dynamics of an entire territory. They weren't just thinking about now, but also about then. The difference between planning the hunt for the week and simply hunting what gets in the way. And that's when the question that transforms the story arises. How could two human species, so close in terms of their physical capabilities, have such different destinies? While the Neanderthals persisted in their local dominance with practical mastery and ancient adaptation, the Cro-Magnons were restless explorers and inventors, ready to break the patterns at every obstacle. It was as if one species had learned to play chess, while the other still bet everything on arm wrestling, but the environment was changing too quickly. The glaciations caused not only cold, but also ecological instability, extinction of large herbivores, sudden changes in plant cycles, emergence of new predators, disappearance forever of ancient migration routes. The flexibility of the Cro-Magnons was beginning to prove deadly effective. While the Neanderthals struggled to maintain their hunting tradition, the Cro-Magnons invented new traditions: nets to capture birds, techniques for preserving food, new types of more mobile shelters. It was as if, silently, with each inventive step, Cro-Magnon was writing a new rule for human survival, a rule that said, adapt before the world demands it. And these differences began to become more and more visible during meetings between the two groups, because where the Neanderthals saw known territory, the Cro-Magnons saw infinite possibilities, and where the Neanderthals saw a threat, the Cro-Magnons saw an opportunity, a silent divergence, but inevitable. And soon, very soon, this underground tension would explode, not like open war, not like an epic battle, but like something much more subtle and much more fatal. Nature, indifferent, continues its brutal dance of changes and extremes. But for Neanderthals and Cro-Magnons, each winter was now an increasingly risky gamble, and the disturbing question echoed under the frozen sky: who was really destined to stay, and who would be just a shadow in the caves of time? As the silent clash between Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals intensified, the real enemy rose implacably, an invisible, subtle, but devastating enemy, planet Earth itself. The end of the Ice Age was not a simple, catastrophic event, like a disaster movie. It was a painfully slow process, a series of small apocalypses that unfolded over thousands of years, requiring an almost superhuman capacity for adaptation from its inhabitants. The climate began to fluctuate suddenly. Years of extreme cold were followed by decades of relative warmth. Forests appeared where there was once only ice, only to be replaced centuries later by arid steppes. The ancient rivers have dried up. New glaciers advanced without warning. It was a world in constant transformation, in which nothing could be taken for granted. And the Neanderthals were stuck in their roots. Their masterful adaptation to the cold and the hunting of large herbivores have now become a trap. Mammoths, bison, and woolly rhinos, their main food sources, began to disappear, victims of environmental changes too. rapid for their species to withstand. As prey disappeared, familiar territories became death traps, and unstable weather made hunting even more dangerous. Neanderthals were forced to migrate desperately. But where to go if every corner of the world seemed equally threatening? The Cro-Magnons, on the other hand, thrived on chaos. Their versatile tools allowed them to hunt smaller animals. Nets, traps, and hooks meant that fish, birds, and small mammals were now also on the menu. In a world where giants were disappearing, the Cro-Magnons had already changed strategy. And there was something else: culture. While the Neanderthals reproduced the same techniques thousands of years ago because they had always worked, the Cro-Magnons were constantly innovating. Each generation brought new ways of dressing, new weapons, new ways of building shelter. This culture of innovation was not just technological, it was mental, it was emotional. The Cro-Magnons formed exchange networks that extended over hundreds of kilometers. They exchanged tools, paintings, rare shells, stories, and with them, valuable information on how to survive new challenges. For a Cro-Magnon, each tribe was a window to new techniques. For a Neanderthal, any strange territory represented a mortal risk. And as the environment changed, Neanderthals became smaller and smaller islands in a changing sea. Imagine a small group of Neanderthals trapped between icy mountains and impassable forests, with the number of prey decreasing, the hunters dying, fear becoming a constant companion. Meanwhile, on the open plains, groups of Cro-Magnons celebrated successful hunts, innovated their clothing to withstand unpredictable climates, and strengthened their alliances with other tribes, expanding their safety nets. What was once a simple difference in lifestyle has now become a silent death sentence. It was not a declared war. These were not violent mass killings. It was something far more tragic. A slow, inexorable replacement. Each harsh winter harvested more Neanderthals. Each arid summer made them more fragile. Each failed migration costs even more lives. Meanwhile, the Cro-Magnons were multiplying, exploring new territories, absorbing and adapting everything they found. And yet there was something more, a disturbing question that still echoes today in the silent corridors of abandoned caves. Were Neanderthals simply outnumbered, or were they on some level absorbed? Modern studies suggest that yes, there was conflict, but there was also alliances, coexistence, and eventually interbreeding between species. Little Neanderthal sparks still live within us, hidden in our DNA, like echoes of a vanished lineage. But back then, for those who lived and died in freezing cold, there was no room for such niceties. It was win or disappear. The earth, impassive, continued to change. Rivers flowed into new beds. The forests advanced and retreated like sleeping giants. And under an unforgiving gray sky, the last Neanderthals fought their last battle. But how exactly did the collapse happen? How could a species that dominated the European continent for hundreds of thousands of years fall so slowly into oblivion? The answer is even darker than you think. In the bitter cold of the late Pleistocene, the silence of the mountains began to swallow up the last whispers of an ancient lineage. The Neanderthals were disappearing, not with glorious brilliance, not in legendary battles, but in the silent oblivion that involves those who cannot adapt to a new world. The extinction of the Neanderthals was not a sudden event. It was a series of small defeats accumulated over thousands of years, a cycle of loss, suffering, and above all, isolation. They lost the territory. As the Cro-Magnons expanded, areas previously dominated by Neanderthals were conquered, not by declared wars, but by the simple, overwhelming presence of a more flexible, more numerous, and more adaptable people. They lost their fangs. Without large herbivores to hunt, without trade networks, without long-range technologies, many Neanderthal groups could simply no longer support themselves. Hunger began to ravage the most vulnerable. Children and the elderly first, then warriors and hunters. They have lost their cohesion. With fewer members, social networks have fragmented. Small, isolated groups roamed increasingly hostile regions, struggling to survive in a world that no longer recognized them as their masters. And even more devastating, they have lost hope. Archaeological. Signs indicate that later Neanderthals abandoned complex cultural practices. The tools have become more rustic. Signs of art and decoration disappear. It is as if, in the end, they have lost not only the battle for physical survival, but also the invisible flame that drives creativity, innovation, and faith in the future. But why? What is the real cause of this disappearance? Modern science offers several theories, and perhaps they are all true, intertwined in a cruel web. Abrupt climate change. Neanderthals were experts in cold environments, but rapid fluctuations between extreme cold and warming made their methods obsolete. Competition. With the Cro-Magnons' better weapons, better social organization and exchange networks have made Homo sapiens more resilient to ecological crises. Low genetic diversity. Neanderthals were already genetically vulnerable before intensive contact with the Cro-Magnons. This meant that diseases, environmental changes, or even small conflicts had devastating effects. Genetic absorption. DNA analysis shows that many of us carry fragments of Neanderthal genes. This suggests that in some cases the two groups crossed paths and merged. It wasn't just destruction, there was mixing. But the most uncomfortable truth is that there was not a single fatal blow. The extinction of the Neanderthals was the result of 1,000 small deaths, physical, cultural, and spiritual. Imagine a group of Neanderthals trapped in a cave on the rocky shores of what is now the Spanish coast. The wind whistles through empty passages. Bonfires can barely keep the cold away. There aren't enough fighters to go around. Old people tell stories of a time when prey was plentiful and land was endless. Children hear, but their skin is thin. Their eyes are dull. On the plains, bands of Cro-Magnons gather around large fires, exchanging tools, information, music. They hunt, fish, explore. They are building the future. Here in the cave, the last Neanderthals watch the past die before their eyes, and no god, no hero, no force of nature will come to save them. They were once the kings of the world. Now they are just echoes in the rocks. Evidence suggests that the last known Neanderthal lived on the Iberian Peninsula around 40,000 years ago. A lone individual, perhaps, the last of his tribe, helplessly watching the end of a lineage that had resisted everything but change. And in that final moment, the history of humanity changed forever. For what remained was not just the victory of one species over another. It is the birth of a new era, that of Homo sapiens, who will shape the entire world with his ideas, his wars, his dreams. But the question remains, were we really victorious? Or is it that by extinguishing the Neanderthal, flame forever, we have also lost something essential, something we can never get back? The answer may be buried in our bones. Today, as we walk the illuminated streets of cities or navigate the digital seas of the internet, we unknowingly carry fragments of a history far older than we can imagine. Within us, in the hidden curves of our DNA, whisper the echoes of two worlds, the intrepidity of the Cro-Magnons and the silent resistance of the Neanderthals. The extinction of the Neanderthals was not just the disappearance of a species, it was the loss of another way of seeing the world. A spirit who survived the unimaginable, who shaped stone, who hunted giants, who loved, suffered, and dreamed, just like us. When we consider the threats to our very existence today, climate, change, conflict, isolation, perhaps we should remember those that came before, of those who thought they were invincible until the world changed. Ultimately, will we learn what the Neanderthals could not learn? Or will we be just another echo in eternity?